Okay, please come in, please come in. So, welcome to what I believe to be the final media and entertainment session you have at Unreal Fest 2022. So, congrats on making it this far, and I greatly appreciate you coming out. My name is Warren Drones. I'm a technical product manager at Epic Games on the broadcast team. Thanks for spending your final session with me. So we're going to be talking about how to use the remote control API today. I'm assuming from the numbers in here, a good number of you are familiar with it, but if not, that's also okay. We're going to kind of talk through some of the basics and just what it is. So first, I wanted you guys to take a quick look at the agenda, so that way you can kind of see what kind of topics we're going to discuss. So starting at the top, we're going to just go through the what and why. Then we get into some of the basics. I will say this is not going to be a deep dive kind of lab course, so I'm not going to give a in-depth tutorial, but I will show you the very foundations on how you would get started with each of the different applications you can use. And then, yeah, we'll kind of talk through the web app, as well as how to use HTTP request and the C++ API library. And then I'll just kind of briefly go over protocol support for external peripherals and hardware. And then after that, we're going to go right into 5.1 features, and that's where the bulk of our time is going to be spent. So hopefully there'll be some exciting new stuff for you guys to learn about. And yeah, let's kind of get into it. So obviously the first question is going to be, what the heck is remote control? And the simplest way I can say it is it's a easy way to communicate with Unreal in a non-direct fashion. And I know it seems like a very vague and abstract way of saying it, but that's kind of the best way I can, given the fact that remote control can be used in a ton of ways, which we'll kind of go over. Um, so why would you want to use it? On the right side, you can kind of see a few quick options and some of the use cases that I find can be quite effective for remote control. But we'll start with some editor favorites, and that's just kind of the idea of not clicking around through your viewport for everything, not trying to select multiple actors. You can kind of aggregate what you need into one central location. And if that's all you use remote control for, we're happy for you to use it in that way. Then we'll kind of talk through power users and dedicated panels, and that gets into the idea of production roles, where you might say, oh, I'm a colorist, or I'm a DP, or a camera op, and I just want to have a specific set of things I want to control in an organized fashion instead of just details panel hunting. Um, and as I said earlier, we are going to talk through protocols, and that'll be MIDI, DMX, and OSC. For this example, we'll be talking through OSC because that was easy to demonstrate on just one machine. And then later we'll talk through externalized web control and custom application use. So yeah, let's get right into it. Let's first talk through some common examples in the field you might have already seen. So a few months ago, we introduced the Hype Chamber broadcast sample. Hopefully a lot of you made it to Andy and BK's The Future of Broadcast Graphics session that was yesterday. We went through that process, and to be honest, we kind of learned that it's not the easiest thing in the world to do data-driven graphics and motion design inside of Unreal yet. But one key tool that we used to make that process a little bit easier, and we shipped a small sample with it, was the remote control preset. You can also see that our partners at Zero Density, who power the Weather Channel's virtual set, as well as the Fox NASCAR set, they chose to use remote control API as their means of communication. So yeah, it's very battle tested in the field and reliable, so it's ready for production. So as I said, first we're going to start talking about some of the very basics on how to get started with remote control. You can kind of see in the background frame there, obviously, you need to enable the plugin. So I'm just going to kind of play a clip that just goes through some of those essential steps. It's only going to be like a minute or two. As I said, we won't be really focusing on an in-depth tutorial for this, but it should be enough to get you started. So you can see here that I'm going up to the plugins manager and just kind of searching for remote control. All the remote control plugins are kind of clustered together in this list. So at the very minimum, you should enable the remote control API. Still flagged as beta, but it's a little bit beyond beta. So I went ahead and just enabled the plugin. After that, you'll get the remote control category in your creation menu. So if you right click into a content browser, you can just click to create a new remote control preset asset, as I'm doing there, naming it Unreal Fest. So now you can just open that asset, and this will give you our dedicated panel. As you can see, it's been improved and updated in UE5 a little bit. And you'll also see on the right side, this gives you expose button and unexposed button next to your editor properties. So I went ahead and just kind of exposed that location of that monitor you see in the background there, and then you can see that it's directly binded to the details panel, so I can manipulate that easily, sorry. And right here, I'm just kind of showing that once you kind of frame up a shot in a production setting, it's quite easy to then just manipulate it through the preset panel. I'm going through here and just kind of exposing, I believe, the focal length and the camera aperture. But one pro tip I wanted to point out is in UE5, we kind of redesigned that details panel, and it kind of tucks away the expose icon, but you can just kind of increase the width of that column and you'll get that back. So here I'm just kind of demonstrating how that looks in action with controlling the focal length. So next I want to talk through editor favorites. And I have an example of what not to do first. So let's kind of show this scenario here. So a lot of the time I see users kind of locking their details panel because they wanted to click an object. Then they'll add a second details panel because they wanted to control something else, but be able to still interact with their first selection. So you can see here, I docked a second details panel, and I'm going to, once again, dock a third. Please don't do this. We put a lot of work into making sure that the pixels that you produce are gorgeous. So Tim Sweeney kind of sheds a tear every time the details panels become larger than the viewport. We'll kind of just go to the next frame here. And this is kind of just a still of what that would look like had I just exposed those same properties to the remote control preset panel. And I have a nice grouping on the left-hand side that allows you to stay organized. And it's just one centralized location. I don't have to multi-select those objects there. So as I said, if this is all you get out of using remote control, if you don't want to use it for any kind of other control, this is a great place to kind of start, and if you need to, stop. Next, we're going to go into our built-in web application. The engine ships with a web app that you can use to kind of get predefined widgets that would allow you to control any of the properties that you've exposed to the remote control preset. So I'm just going to let this GIF kind of loop. And you can see it there in action that sometimes the best tool for the job is an interface that's better suited to the task. So for something like focal length, where you kind of don't want to just scrub infinitely with like a logarithmic scrubber in the details panel, you might want to just set a min and max value range on that widget and just kind of control it there. You also have access to your function library. So if you see on the bottom left there, there's like a small icon, looks like a little function symbol. You can kind of expose any editor or actor functions from that icon. I also wanted to mention that in 5.1, we introduced this idea of a dedicated color correction panel. So all you have to do is at the top, you would just make a new tab, and it's going to ask you, would you like to make a build your own tab, or would you like to use the predefined color correction tab? And you can see in this example, I'm using it to control the color correction region on the left side. And for those of you who haven't heard of color correction regions, that's because it's in a separate plugin. So in the engine, you can enable the color correction region plugin. And what this allows you to do is get localized color correction volumes. I know a lot of people are already familiar with our post-processing volume, and you can kind of unbound that to affect everything in the scene, or you can make a definite bounds, and then it'll affect anywhere that the cameras or the player is inside of. But in this case, you can actually just drop these anywhere and just affect the region in which it covers. You can also change the shape or define a different mesh for it. So it's just a very useful tool. And when you pair that with the color correction panel, you can dynamically create them on that bottom left side down there. or you can also control our lighting cards that way. So hopefully if you've caught any of the ICVFX sessions, they've gone into some of the light card stuff and the new features in 5.1. So yeah, as I said, this might not be a full deep dive, but I wanted to point you to a hidden resource we kind of put out last year. So we did a full playlist on ICVFX production workflows. It was labeled this, the 427 tutorials for virtual production tools. But if you see on the bottom far right-hand side there, the 9th tutorial is actually a deep dive, full discussion into remote control. So those basics I went over, that'll be done by David Gralnick. It also goes through the web app in more detail. So it goes through everything, including what each widget can be used for, how to go through bindings and customize that interface. So do not worry if this kind of went fast for you. There's a resource available. And next, I wanted to mention an area I feel that needs to be demystified the most, and that's kind of the idea that you don't need to use our custom web application. You can build your own. So if you have a team of developers who are familiar with either a C++ library or HTTP messaging, you can use that. So what comes pre-installed with remote control is a set of endpoints that you can use to communicate with. So you can see some very brief examples down there in the bottom right. I'm going to step through a case where I'm using Postman, and you can use any kind of API debugging software or solution you want. I use Postman because I find it easy. Yeah, and you can see there on the right side, like if you had a default workspace and you can replace this with any web client, you can very easily switch to a put or get request. In this case, I'm going to just show that if I use the info endpoint, I can quickly get a list of all your options available in this kind of REST-like API. So you can see there, I'm making sure that in my body message, everything I send is in a JSON format. That's currently the only way we support communication at the moment. So yeah, you should see that quick cheat sheet down there. It also tells you all your REST verbs and all the inputs and how they work. So if ever you're in need of like a quick primer, and in my case, I actually don't take the time to memorize everything I need. I kind of just always start off and I've only memorized the info endpoint and then kind of work my way back from there. You can see here that I'm showing an example where you would use the object property endpoint, and that's a put request. And it's very useful if you just need to have your application kind of read preset values. So you can see there, I'm just kind of getting that relative location of that monitor and getting a response message that kind of just shows the values in UE. I did want to give a bit of a pro tip when it comes to getting those object names and property names. We have a log built into the remote control preset editor. All you have to do is kind of go up top and enable this log. Once you do that, anytime you expose a parameter, you'll get a message here that'll kind of just, sorry, that'll kind of just show you the official property name as well as the object reference. So I kind of find this the most useful way to sometimes just get an object's actual path reference and true property name, since a lot of people who are not familiar with Python or C++ probably have not ever heard the fact that most property names are kind of just labels. So just continuing into another example, this is the endpoint you'll probably use the most, which is an object call. And this basically allows you to call functions on an object in UE. You can see there that I'm using the set relative rotation. Yeah, I'm using the set relative rotation function. And this is kind of like a default function that comes into any object in the actor class type. Later I'll show if you just wanted to use your own custom one. But in the body section, you can very easily define the parameters. So you can see here, I'm just gonna say I wanna change that rotation. and I do a send, it will update, and I'll always get a result back, so that way you can kind of easily debug and see what happened there. And yeah, I'll send that back and go to the next example. So yeah, say that you had your own custom function or blueprint function that you defined, like I do there. You just have to expose that to the editor if you wanted to work in non-Pi mode. After you do that, it will become blueprint callable here. So that way I can just quickly send a put request. And since my function didn't have any parameters to pass, I can just press send and see that update there. So I'm just doing a quick function that just toggles between the two team names featured in the hype chamber. So, yep. As far as the C plus API, I'm sorry, C++ API, I couldn't recreate an environment here for this session that shows a custom application kind of sending those commands. But at the very least, I did want to kind of just explain the workflow a little bit and just point you guys to some resources online. In the same area, we have the rest of our documentation. There's a remote control quick start. And in that quick start, it kind of will tell you where we store a miniature application that's actually shipped with the engine. And you can use that as a basis to import and customize your own application. I will mention also that the C++ API library obviously has access to more low-level parts of the engine. So if you're a strong developer and you need to access things like F-property handles, this is where you would want to do that at. So next, I wanted to talk about protocol support. So if you had peripherals and hardware devices like MIDI keyboards and DMX lights, remote control makes it very easy for you to bind those objects and control them inside of UE. So you can see there, it's just kind of a quick frame of the DMX sample. And on the left side, you can see that I'm binding a OSC property. So I thought a nice way to point out how I would recommend to get started with this is to first, please make sure you're actually sending data to your machine. We get a lot of support calls sometimes that are just kind of, well, we're not seeing it pop up in UE, but at the end of the day, it was really that MIDI device wasn't actually sending to your own hardware. So I recommend using an application like Protocol, and that's Protocol with a K instead of a C in its name. And you can check for both incoming and outgoing MIDI and OSC inputs. And on the right side, you see I made a virtual OSC set of controllers there. There's just two faders, and I did that in OSC Pilot. You can also use something called Touch OSC, which, if you're familiar with it, is just a mobile application. So you can do the same thing I'm doing here, but just have it on your phone. As long as you're on the same network as your machine, you can actually control Unreal in the same way from your mobile device. So great low budget solution for those who want to get started with protocols. Yep. So here is how to kind of do it in action. Obviously, you'll need to enable a separate plugin for each protocol type that you want to use. We currently support DMX, MIDI, and OSC. As I said, I'm using OSC, so that way you could see an on-screen example, but the process works the same with any kind of MIDI piece of hardware. So after I've created the remote control preset asset, I can now just go to the top right and kind of enable this new protocol view. And you can see there that the columns and fields kind of changed a little bit. So that way we could show the address field as well as the recording slot. In this example, I'm just kind of going to that camera focal length example again. And you can see that I'm hovering over the OSC button on the top right of the panel. But if I had enabled the other plugins, I would be able to toggle between DMX's MIDI as well. So yeah, after you create a binding, it should show up in that bottom panel there, and I just need to define what I want those input ranges to be. And you can just enable UE to be in a listen state with that red record button there. And then it makes it very easy to just pick up on whatever the next incoming device input is, and it'll automatically bind that connection to what you have exposed there. So with very little work and no scripting, I was able to quickly just attach that virtual controller to my Cine camera's focal length. And I did the same thing with aperture. So yeah, I wanted to at least call out in 5.1, we added support for masking. So if you work with colors or vector properties, you can very quickly just say, all right, I want to go from position 1 to position 2, but I don't want to define 2 of these axes of that position. Because a lot of time in programming, you'll have to say, all right, I want to really just go up 100 units, but because I'm working in 3D space, those are 3 vector. I need to somehow get my X and Y, but ignore keep them current while just adjusting the z-axis. And now you don't have to worry about that. You can kind of just define 2 different locations and then just mute out those channels that you are not interested in. So now we get to the more fun stuff, the stuff that is in 4.1 preview. So that's available for you today. And the first thing is going to be something that Andy Blondin kind of hinted at in the discussion yesterday, and that's the new logic system that we added to remote control. I did not trust myself to work through this in a timely manner, so I'm actually going to play back kind of a clip that I was able to record last night, and hopefully it'll give you a pretty good understanding on how this workflow is meant to be used.
Okay, so now let's take an early look at the remote control logic system and toolset we've added in 5.1 preview. So you can see here we're back in the Studio B scene, and it's a slightly modified version of the scene you might have noticed with a little bit of our hype chamber branding showcased here. The only other thing you'll see here is I have a sequence open that showcases off one of our metahumans, I believe his name is Miles, and I kind of just posed him for this frame. And if you take this pilot this camera, we'll see it's just a standard news or studio reporting kind of framing here. So head to toe with a monitor kind of centralized in the middle there. So I'm actually going to exit out of this camera view and go back to my content browser and very quickly just go over what our game plan is going to be for this demo. You can see here that I have this red glowing pattern, these red accents along the floor, and some of these blue accents featured in the studio, along with this Unreal Racing League team branding here with the logo. What I want to do is expose some of these elements that I just went over to a remote control preset, and then modify their property in a way that allows me to override this entire studio theme with another team's branding in a way that also requires zero blueprinting or technical knowledge to execute. So to start this process, I'm actually going to come right here into the Unreal Fest folder again, and I'm going to go into my presets folder, and I'll right click here and go to remote control, where I'll find the remote control preset asset. And same process as before, I'll create this asset. I'll call it RC Logic Demo. And I'll go ahead and save this just in case. And double click this asset to open it up. Once again, I have the same remote control panel as before, but this time I'm actually going to enable this logic view here. So you can see I get a couple new panels. Actually, I get 3 new panels, sorry. One being controllers, and these 2 don't currently have any information, and those will be populated once we get started with adding our own bits of behavior, and we'll get into that in a second. All right, so first, those properties that I mentioned before, I'm going to go ahead and start exposing those to the preset panel, and I'll do that by selecting them directly and then looking for these elements like this material here, this red glow. I'll actually bring that over, and then I'll click here and click to expose that to my preset panel. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll actually create a group first and call this theme. And I'll go back to all, and I'll actually click this. Oops, sorry. I'll click this and drag it into my theme group. That way I'm staying organized. I'll do the same thing with this blue glow here. So I'll double click this. I see that there's a glow color parameter, and I'll expose that. So exit this one out. All right, here. Now I have those 2. I'll want to go a little bit below the scene here, and you can see I have these hex patterns here and the chevron pattern in the background. So I'll click the chevron, double click this material, and I'll expose this color parameter. And I'll do the same for one of these hexagons. Since they're sharing the same material, I only have to do it to this one. So at this point, I have, I think, all the color parameters that I want to control, but I'll go ahead and make another group and call this team info. We'll call it team info. And there I'll actually expose the logo itself, since I know I want to change that, and the text here. I'll come in a little bit tighter so I can click this, and I want to expose this text field there. Okay, I'll save this, and now I'll go back above so I can get a good view of everything, and I'll start by explaining this controller section. So in its simplest terms, the controllers are virtualized properties and variables that I can assign behaviors to over here. And these behaviors are configurable, and they add a form of logic to control the exposed values we added over here. So I'll actually work through an example, and hopefully that context will help it make a bit more sense. So let's click this plus sign here. You can see I have several types of controls to choose from. I'm actually going to go with the string for now. You can call the string whatever you like. I'm going to call it team, since that's what I'll be using as my input to drive everything. And you'll notice that when I have nothing selected, this behavior section here is blank, but when I click a valid controller, it becomes accessible, and I can now assign behaviors. So let's assign a behavior, and I'll start with a simple one called conditional here as the second option on the list. And the conditional behavior, I'm going to click, and you can see if I hover here, I get a tooltip that kind of explains what this behavior does. And it says, if a value matches the set condition, apply action list. The action list that it's referring to is a stack down here that I'm going to populate with set values of these properties over here. So I'm going to go ahead and name this default behavior, this default input value, URL, and that's for Unreal Racing League, not for the internet. And I'm going to just grab this whole group here with all these theme elements and drag them down here into my stack. So you can see here, it immediately creates a table that says URL, set base color, set glow color, set color for the chevron, and set color for the hex. And I'll actually grab the team info as well, because I think I want to set those values too. Now what I want to do is introduce a second team. So let's go ahead and click this input value here on the conditional and type a second team name in. So I'm going to go with SGA because I already know that team is another team that we feature in the Hype Chamber sample. So I'm going to click enter, and I'll actually click the theme group again and drag it into the stack. But this time you can see it's giving me values associated with SGA. So I'm going to go ahead and actually change some of these values. For instance, when SGA is used, I think I want my main color to be a bit more yellow. I want this background glow color to be a bit more on the teal side. So I'm actually going to lift that. And let's make it a tiny bit more teal. Okay. And this chevron color should also be a bit more on the teal side. I'll go that way. And I think I want this hex symbol to be on the yellow side as well. And I'll, I forgot to add some team info, so I'll do that now too. Still has SGA selected, so I'll grab this group and add it to the stack. And I'll come down here and say I want the team name to be SGGIA Aero Dynamica. Fictional name, so it doesn't matter if I spelled it correctly. But I did notice that I want to assign a different logo for when that's being used. So let's go to the content browser, and I'm going to go to the esports sample folder, artistic elements, team elements and meshes. And I can see I have all these logos here. I want to use this one. So I'm actually going to select that, go back to remote control, and then assign this one. And just for safe measure, I'm actually going to browse to the hex logo here, and make sure that I assigned some value for when URL is being used. Okay, so at this point, I'm actually going to save and give it a shot. So when I type in URL, I'm going to click enter, and I should see very little to no change, which is great. And now I'm going to type in SGA and give it 1 second to load those assets for the first time, but I should see several properties in the scene change. And now it looks like it's done. So we can see here this yellow and teal branding has kind of taken over the full studio and looks more like a separate team. I'm actually going to go through and follow the same pattern to add at least one more team here. So just give me 1 second to add this to the list. That way we can get a nice sample size to showcase off this conditional behaviors power. And with that, I've added the 2 new additional teams. We can take a look here in the action stack. If I just scroll down, you can see I've added values for Team Horsepower Motorsport, as well as a Machine Futurist, which is MFT down below. So let's just see those in action. I'm going to click into the input field here and type in HPM. Let's give that a go. And you can see that updated live. And let's try the final team here. Awesome. And with that, I wanted to very briefly discuss the else option found in the condition behavior. And this just ensures that we have some common sense defaults in case a user inputs a invalid response into this input field on their controller. So for that, I actually wanted to emulate the URL team theme when someone puts in an invalid response. So to do that, first I want to update these values to URL here. That way I have them to pull from on this exposed side. And I'll actually click this else option there, and I'll just drag them the same way I've done the other team themes. And if I scroll down, you'll see them defined there, and I'll do the same with team info. And I'll just make sure I have a logo set there. So I'm gonna search for the logo team. And now you can see if I go to another team like HPM and click enter, and my next input is something bizarre like crazy idea, you can see that this is registering as an else condition and applying those default values. Okay, so with that, I wanted to at least briefly mention one more common behavior type, and I think that'll best be shown with these lights in the scene. So I'm going to press G and reveal all the numerous lights we showcase in the virtual set, but I actually just care about maybe this light right here, this general spotlight, and this other light that we have lighting the talent. So I'll control click grab those two, and I'll make a new group, and I'll call this lights. And for those, I'm actually going to try to control their color value. So I'm going to go over here and click expose property. And you can see I've added both those light colors to my exposed panel. And that means I can actually just press G again to clean up this UI. And I want you to take a look down here back in the expose section and to click this drag handle on one of these properties here, and I can drag those directly into the controller stack. And what this does is it will automatically create a new controller of that type, as well as a bind behavior. This bind behavior obviously allows this controller to drive this exposed property. So if I was to update this one here to a orange like this, you can see that's being affected in the scene. And where the power comes in is now I could also just add this second light to this same stack. And now I'm controlling two lights from a single controller. And I can continue to add several lights to this bind behavior stack and drive them as one without the need to create a blueprint CAS system or any kind of logic using a master blueprint. And with that, you actually now have two different controllers, both with their own behavior defined, as well as an action table below defining and controlling several properties. Which brings up my next point being sometimes you don't want to risk any kind of change to the configurations you might have listed in the logic section of remote control. And you can reduce the ability for error by simply going to the top and toggling this operation view here. So I'll actually click that. And what you might have noticed is I've actually lost the large property list on the left side, as well as the behavior stack and the configuration panel on the right. So at this point, the only thing I can do is input new fields and inputs into my controllers to update and drive changes in the scene. But I cannot mess with any of the underlying logic and then risk breaking any of my rules that I've defined there. So actually, I will toggle back to setup and talk through enabling the logic again, clicking the conditional behavior, and this toggle you also see here. This is our enable disable toggle for any behavior. You can actually go to any behavior, and select this to disable any of the functionality found within that behavior. That way you can continue to work in that non-destructive fashion. And so with that, I'll actually be wrapping up this very high level and simplistic overview into the remote control logic system. I hope that this is giving you at least enough intrigue to try out this new tool in Unreal Engine 5.1 preview that's available today.
Sorry, I cut off the mic. I got tired of hearing myself for a second there. But thank you. Before we wrap up, I'm just going to introduce one more new tool for you. You can kind of see there. I'll click play on this one. I wanted to introduce the Render Grid plugin. For our artists coming from the motion design world or from the broadcast world, and a lot of times you kind of just need to quickly batch version your assets. And you need to do that in a way where you don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be before that production day. For instance, in an award show, you might not even know who the winner is until just beforehand. And in some cases with like news graphics, they're data powered. So the text field that's going to be showcased in your graphic is undefined. So the Render Grid plugin allows you to take advantage of the power of Movie Render Queue for your outputs, while also reading from the remote control preset. So that way you can kind of just quickly expose fields and then manipulate them on a per job level, so you don't have that commitment you normally do have with direct scripting. Oh, sorry, I think it stopped playing. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of run through how you actually get started with this new plugin. So you just need to enable the Render Grid. It's flagged as experimental right now. So just be aware that there will be several like UI and UX updates. It's subject to change. After you do, you can go in the miscellaneous section and you can find the new asset type to create. So I'm just kind of showcasing creating one there. And after I open it, you'll see what the default UI looks like. But I did want to mention that there's a couple prereqs. Obviously, you need a really, really cool level sequence that kind of that you want a version of first. So make sure you have that. And you also need a remote control preset with the properties exposed to it that you want to change. So in this case here, you can see that I have team logos. I think I have 3 of them. as well as a fourth one that's just kind of like a 2D logo decal on the ground there. So this kind of just shows how I can hot swap those. The last thing you might want to have is probably a movie render queue configuration file. Obviously, since you're going to be using MRQ under the hood, you might as well take advantage of it by defining some console variables that really get the maximum quality out. So yeah, this is what the UI looks like by default. Once you're in here, you'll notice the viewport centralized in the bottom middle. That kind of just says add a job. So that's what I kind of did there. And after you select the job, you'll see on the right hand side for the per job settings that it wants you to define a sequence, and then on the left side it wants you to pick which preset you want to pull those variables from. So I'm just selecting the logo bumps there, and you can see that immediately gets loaded on the right side. Again, not final UI, so that's why you don't kind of see like nice grouping, but you have access to everything you need there. After that, you can kind of just select a animation to go alongside that. And once you do, every job will automatically kind of define the start and end time based on that level sequence, and you can kind of just use the bottom to scrub through those. I'm going here and just clicking that movie render preset that I predefined and just setting that in line. We thought it would be a better UI experience for those coming from the editing and media world if they could just kind of work in line with like setting what render preset you want to use. You can also see there that we have overrides for resolution, so you can kind of work at the job level just to say, I want to see what my resolution outputs are going to be, and I can override those. You can also change your output directory. So instead of doing it in the config, that's available at the surface level. And I'm sure you've noticed by now there's about 3 options in the viewport section below. The viewport section that's there by default obviously is just a real-time viewport, similar to what you see in the main editor. But I wanted to mention that you can toggle to the preview frame mode, and this will give you an actual output example of what you would get in MRQ for that frame. So it'll cache that, and it's kind of just under the hood executing movie render quickly and displaying that for you. If you click the rendered view, it's actually going to go ahead and almost do like a RAM preview from After Effects. It's going to kind of render out the entire solution, so that way you can cache everything, kind of scrub through. Very useful, so that way you can toggle between the viewport and the rendered view and kind of get an A/B comparison on what you will actually have when you export something out. Once you're satisfied with everything, you can see on the top left there, there's a render button, and this will just execute a batch render across everything that's loaded in the queue. You can also just disable specific jobs similar to MRQ on the left side with those checkboxes. And the last thing I wanted to mention for RenderGrid is it's an actual asset, so that means it has its own blueprint graph. We've gone through and exposed some custom functions regarding RenderGrid, so you can see there's events regarding individual jobs, as well as like the batch process or the queue, as well as just generally when you open up the editor. This example on screen here is just me saying, all right, every time I want to render a job, maybe I want to do some logic that connects to the movie render subsystem, so that way I can actually connect to a WebSocket, and that way I want to do a progression check that will kind of just get the render executor and send a progress message out as a HTTP message, similar to what we showed earlier. So a very specific use case, but I was kind of just working through potential options and just showing that you can kind of do that sort of TD work here. At the bottom, I was just wanted to mention that you can click any custom event you have here, and similar to an editor utility widget, you can kind of just expose those to the editor, and it'll be a button back in the listing view. But that example kind of just shows if you wanted to say, get all actors like cine cameras in the scene and generate a job in my list for each of them. So you can see there, that's where any kind of function button would appear. So that way you can kind of do your custom logic and generate those jobs at a button click. And I just wanted to kind of prove to you that nothing was a lie. Um, so you can see here, when I clicked that batch render button earlier, this is kind of the output of what you get from the render grid. So it's going to take those job IDs and automatically make folders for you. And inside any of those folders, you can see I use the preset that output some raw JPEGs, but I kind of did that UHD resolution. So I believe that is kind of it. So I know that was a lot of information, but I wanted to say thank you for coming to this session, and I'll be around for a little bit if we want to do a bit of QA, or if you just want to approach me, I'll be here for the next few. So thank you.